Alan Clark from the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. Alan received his bachelor's degree in wildlife science at the University of Maine and his master's in wildlife management from Virginia Tech. He went on to spend 23 years at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. In 1996, Alan joined the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources as a wildlife planning manager. In 1998, he became the wildlife section chief with the division. In this position, he and his Salt Lake staff are responsible for all terrestrial wildlife programs in the state of Utah, from black-footed ferrets to Mexican spotted owl to sage grouse, cougars, and big game. In 2006, Alan was selected to the position of assistant director with the division supervising 5 regions and 3 management sections. That's aquatics, habitat, and wildlife. So let's give Alan a welcome.
If some of you were planning on taking some rest while I spoke, I hope you don't mind sleeping with the lights on, because I'm probably the only speaker in the next 2 days who's not going to have a PowerPoint in that. So I like to tell my kids I'm old-fashioned, and they tell me I'm just old. So instead I've got to work through that issue. It was really enjoyable to hear our first two speakers this morning talk. I've known both of those individuals, Terry for much longer than I have Fred, but we've worked together on projects, and Fred made reference to our little experiment over at Deseret dealing with elk, and that was kind of something we schemed up to say, can we do something to change elk behavior? And so that was an interesting thing to work on in that. And Terry and I can remember years and years of being in little tiny offices working on things at Unity College and so on quite a few years ago, huh, Terry? So that's good. I'm going to go through, and I assume there'll probably be a few questions. I like to view myself, although looking at the program there are a couple others, but I'm kind of the token manager out of this. You have some really good science you've already had presented, and we'll have a lot more. But I want to address you a little bit from the perspective of a management agency and what we need to do and dealing with these issues. Jim Karpowitz, who's my boss and DWR director, is sorry he couldn't be here. I told Frank I'd give you a little hard time, is that this is a tough time for the conference, to schedule a conference where you want to try to get wildlife people here when it's the peak of our big game hunting seasons and the general deer hunt going on this week. And so anyway, I got to work on Frank a little bit since he works for me and get him to schedule a little better next year as far as the timing. But anyway, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about how we manage big game in Utah. I know there's a lot of people have a lot of questions. There's a great deal of misunderstanding, so that's what I want to focus on for just a few minutes and then give you a chance to ask some questions. I want to tell you just real quickly about the talk you almost heard that you aren't. Jim put together a presentation that, after talking about it, we titled the 10 Missed About DWR. And so what we did is we made a list. What are the things that people tell us as we go around the state that we do that aren't true? And some of them they tell us are true, but these happen to be the ones that weren't true. But it's interesting that at least 3 of the topics that are being addressed over the next 2 days were on that list of 10, which kind of led me to the idea of talking about this a little bit. First of all, we hear from a lot of people that we don't care, DWR doesn't care about rangeland health or resource damage. All we care about is having big animals for hunters. Not true. And we hear that deer and elk populations have greatly increased and exceed population objectives around the state. That's something that's not true. And then the third thing we hear frequently is that we're expanding big game populations without regard to other stakeholders, that people don't have a chance to get involved. We just have secret meetings in dark rooms and decide how many elk and deer that we'll try to manage. And I want to assure you that's not true. Very few people know that there's actually a state law that requires us to do certain things in the management of deer and elk in the state. The law has been in place for quite a while. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about what's in the law. And that law not only says what has to be in a plan, but it also guarantees that there's going to be involvement from lots of different stakeholders, people, from landowners, from hunters, from other interested publics that want to be involved. That's guaranteed in state law. And so the process we use gives them that opportunity. Then on top of what's guaranteed in our in the law about just deer and elk management plans, then we also have a state law mandated process that includes regional advisory councils that have to hear all of these proposals and accept public involvement, and then the Wildlife Board who actually sets the policy. It isn't the division, it's the Wildlife Board who sets that policy. So there's a lot of opportunities. In the talk today, what I want to just really briefly cover are three items. What does the state law say about big game management? What does it say about big game management plans? The second thing, real quickly, what does a management plan include? A lot of you may not have seen them. If you want to see them, they're all on our website. You can go on our website, access any of the management plans, either for the species-wide management in the state or for unit management plans. And they're there, and sometimes a little hard to find, but if you do a search on our website, you can find the unit plans as well. And then finally, how is a management plan then used in the management of big game? I have a number of mentors, having worked in this field almost 40 years now, that I look back to, but one of the ones that probably had a huge influence on me was an individual named Bill Heselton, which when I was doing a lot of planning stuff in Maine, he came to us one day and says, "You guys do all these great plans, best plans in the country. When are you going to do something with them?" And so that was kind of, I've used that as a motto. If we're not going to do something with a plan, we're not going to do a plan. Let's just have fun and do things the way we want it. But if we do a plan, we're going to follow it. And so that's what we use as kind of guidance in that. Okay, what does the state law say about plans, first of all? The law was passed in 1994. You can look it up if you care in Utah Code. It's Chapter 23, Section 16, Paragraph 7. Lays out exactly what needs to be in a deer and elk management plan in the state. It requires the division to prepare a management plan for each deer and elk unit in the state. In developing the plans, the division must consult with public land managers, private landowners, sportsmen, ranchers, and there's a long list, county officials, and so on. So there's a requirement that we consult with people and get input. Management plans must have target herd size objectives. As hard as it is, and those of you who are scientists in the audience and work in this field know, as hard as it is to come up with how many are there, and we resist that as biologists and managers, it says we have to have target herd objectives. We have to have something we're managing towards. And so that's there. In establishing these objectives, the Division of the Wildlife Board must consider the carrying capacity of the range and land ownership. So we can't do it independent of looking at those things. Jim Davis is going to talk a little bit about how we try to involve our long-term range trend information that we've collected from a number of years in trying to calculate what's that carrying capacity and what's going on. But we try to use the best information, the best science available. And the other thing that the Wildlife Board has to do is balance multiple uses for the range. We can't say we're only going to look at elk or we're only going to look at deer. We have to look at a balance of all the uses that occur on the unit. Livestock, recreation, all of those things have to be taken into consideration. Finally, once the plans are approved, this is the real kicker in the law, the division said we're required to manage each herd unit in accordance with the plan. So the legislature also didn't want to do just planning for planning's sake, but they told us we actually have to manage. I'll tell you a little bit about how we interpret what that means for us. So what's a management plan include? Utah, we have both statewide plans and unit plans. The statewide plans are kind of the overriding document that says this is the overall direction that we want to go with the management of a species in the state. What do we want to do? Every plan, whether it's a unit plan or a statewide plan, has a science-based assessment of the species. In the statewide plan, that also includes life history, management history, habitat, population. It tries to update as much as it can, incorporating in a concise way the information that Terry presented earlier and the information that Fred presented about what do we know about how animals interact with the landscape, and we try to include that in there. We have to have a discussion of issues and concerns with the management of the species, including things like disease, habitat problems, conflicts with landowners, and on and on. Just for example, I took a quick look at both the deer and elk management plans, and I think the deer management plan has 18 or 19 of these large issues that drive it, and I think the elk plan has about 16 listed in it, if I remember the numbers that are there. But these are things that are identified not just by us, but also by people who are out there. So that's kind of where we're at. We do an analysis of the use and demand for the species. We set goals and objectives for population management. So the statewide plan sets an overarching goal, also goals for habitat and for recreation management. So all of those are in there in that statewide plan. And finally, the plan includes strategies, because we have to know what are we going to do now to try to implement the plan. Unit plans are much more detailed. Usually that's where the public has a real interest. The public really cares about their individual area. They want to know what's going on in the Cache unit, or in the Box Elder unit, or in Rich County, or on some of these other units around the state. And that's where people get involved. In the case of elk, I understand there's a lot of interest in the Fish Lake unit and some of the other areas in the state as far as what's going on. But all the plans have these individual unit plans are in there with very specific information. It includes objectives for habitats and populations, an analysis again of the carrying capacity at that lower level now, using much more detailed information, as detailed as we can gather, current habitat conditions, barriers to reaching objectives, and then finally strategies to remove these barriers. Both plans are developed with extensive public input. So I already talked about that a little bit, but in the case of the statewide plan, we have a statewide working group that meets almost forever, don't they, Ken? As far as Ken works with us in the Salt Lake office and was involved in both the deer and elk statewide working groups. And it's a long process, and we don't move ahead until we resolve the issues as we're working through that. We also have local working groups with all the interests represented that guide the development of the unit plan. So we have those there. If you have an interest, get involved. There's plenty of opportunity to get involved with these. Plans are generally developed for longer periods of time. We don't revise them each year. Most of our statewide plans and unit plans are for a 5 to 10 year horizon, because a lot of them include habitat restoration work, and you're wasting your time if you think you're going to do a habitat project in 1 year and have an immediate response in an animal population within a year or two. So they're kind of longer term as we deal with those issues. Final thing I just wanted to mention is, excuse me, how do we use these plans? The plans, I describe it, I do a talk with our new wildlife board members and new RAP members every 2 years when we do a training. And I tell them that we consider the plans a contract. When they adopted that plan, that's now a contract between the division and those entities, between the division and the wildlife board. And we're obligated to honor the contract. And so management actions are directed by the plans. What we do are directed by the plans. The DWR regions conduct annual assessments of where we are in relation to the population objective, and they have to report. We have several of our employees here. Teresa's back there. Wave your hand, Teresa. Is the wildlife manager from the southern region. She has to tell us, where are we at in relation to that plan each year, that plan objective for each unit. So they do that. We involve an update every 5 years. We rotate every year. We have a crew out doing this long-term range trend survey, but we get around to our 5 regions once every 5 years. We update that information. Where are we in relation to that? The DWR regions are required to make hunting recommendations that are consistent with where the populations are in relation to the unit objectives. And so we require recommendations to be consistent. In most cases, the controversial part of it is hunting antlerless animals, hunting the reproductive segment of the population. But we require them to have those recommendations consistent with the goals and objectives in the plans. The third area is DWR regions propose specific habitat projects through the Watershed Restoration Initiative and the partners' local working groups to implement those habitat strategies that are in the plans. We identify where habitat work needs to be done in these plans and then make recommendations for specific projects that flow out of them. And so we use that as a guide. And finally, even our response to social and economic concerns is guided by the plans. For instance, when we have somebody who gives 72-hour notice and says they're going to kill big game that are in their cropland, how we respond to that depends on where we are in relationship to the plan. in the plan objective. So it has a huge effect throughout the state. Kind of conclusions, just real quickly, and then try to leave a couple of minutes for questions, Paul. The content of and process for developing management plans is directed by state law. So that's just a fact. It's directed by state law. There's a process that's there. Management plans, to the best of our ability, are science-based, using again, the best information we can obtain. Management plans are developed with the involvement of all the interested parties out there. Anybody that wants to be involved can be involved at one level or another. Anybody that wants to comment can comment. So there's opportunities throughout the whole process. Once adopted, plans guide our hunting recommendations, our habitat management priorities, and even our response to resolving problems caused by wildlife populations. So the plans serve as that function. What we find out is many times the public or others come to our RAC and board meetings and say they don't like a particular recommendation the division is doing. And when you sit down and talk with them, what you frequently find out is actually they don't agree with what the objective is in the management plan. The problem is it's too late. The management plan's set. We are required by law to recommend consistent with that plan. And so what I try to encourage people is that you need to be involved at the right time in the process. And so that's very important as you do this. I encourage all of you to get involved in the process and do that. Also encourage you that are with land management agencies. I'm sure most of you are plugged in with our habitat, with our watershed restoration initiative, but if you aren't, if you have some good Aspen projects or other projects, let us know. That's a priority habitat. That's a place we want to work. And the division and DNR and all the partners in the group are willing to work in that area. Let me stop there, Paul, and we'll see if there's any questions. Thank you.
Questions? Comments?
How often are the plans updated once they're implemented, meaning the local management?
The local plans are generally updated every 5 years, and it's usually a year behind the statewide plan is the update. So that's generally what we do. Once in a while, the Wildlife Board will want to address a specific area in the plan as far as an option, and they might ask us to delay a little bit beyond that. But in general, it's every 5 years that we update those. They can be updated sooner if we have new information. So we will do that. Yes?
To what extent, or how do you deal with potential conflicts between, for example, a management plan for a deer unit versus an elk unit for the same area in terms of balancing those needs and how those plans are put into place?
Yeah, the individual writes the plans the same person with those. So when you get down to it, it involves those people. We recognize that. That might be one of the issues and concerns. For instance, there's some information that indicates that elk at high densities could be a problem for deer. It's not definitive. There's research that seems to indicate either direction as far as for mule deer, but anyway, so we incorporate that into the process. What we overall try to do is we try to make sure that the statewide plans are consistent, that there's not a conflict between the statewide deer plan and the statewide elk plan. If those are consistent, you can then work it out at the more local level as we implement those. But we recognize there can be conflicts. That's one of the conflicts that we try to address if it's there.
In addition to surveys and any other type of wildlife population modeling that you may use, is there any other kind of habitat evaluation or monitoring that you do as a way to measure your progress on objectives?
That's one of the hardest things to do. We are trying to do some evaluation. We actually have designated some resources through the Watershed Restoration Initiative to try to monitor, okay, you do all these projects, now what does it mean? What's been the response? And so we do a fair amount of that. It's a lot easier to measure the vegetative response than it is the animal response to the vegetative response. And I know we struggle with that a lot. Frank spends most of his waking hours thinking about how we're going to try to design some methodologies to use to do that. But we do employ any of those that we can in the process. One more, Paul, or not?
Yep, we have time for another question.
Yes.
Long-term trends. Do you have many in riparian areas? I think you were looking at Willow.
Yeah. The question was long-term trends in riparian, and particularly in riparian areas that relates to willow. I'm going to defer a little bit and let Jim, because Jim's going to talk about the specifics of some of the long-term range trend information and what we do. So it's adapted over the years. As we become more aware, I think, Jim, you'd say, as we become more aware of other habitats, we've tried to broaden that monitoring out. We do a lot of restoration work in riparian areas. The problem is it's very, very expensive, as any of you who try to do that are aware.
Okay, thank you very much.